And welcome back. The First Alchemist is the book of Tobias Churton. We're also talking about the biography of Aleister Crowley. Tobias, would you call the alchemists almost like the first, not only chemists, but pharmacists?
Metallurgical chemists or industrial chemists, I think. But certainly we're talking about the origins of what we call chemistry, yes.
They would dabble with medicines, you think?
Well, I thought we discussed that one earlier. There's no particular interest in the documents that have survived that suggests that they did any more than that they were aware of pharmacological products and their relationship to chemical substances, but they didn't. The early alchemists, as far as we know, didn't specialize in that particular field.
And you said many of them were women.
But there is a crossover, yes.
Tell me about that. Tell me about the fact that a lot of the alchemists were women.
Well, I think that's one of the really interesting things about it. Partly, it's very interesting. All the early recipes in the Leiden Papyrus and the Stockholm Papyrus, and in a collection of the 4 books of Democritus or Pseudo-Democritus, they're all recipes. So we're talking about we're talking about cooking, really. And I think there is something about the connection between dye making, textiles, decoration, and basically working with a furnace or oven that attracted women to this art. And it appears that men and women were operating this art quite equally in Egypt in these late Roman Empire period, the 1st to the 4th century. And as I say, the most prominent was a lady called Mariam, or Mary, later called Mary the Prophetess, because she believed she was guided in her chemical work by God directly. And she's always talking about alchemy as a revelation to her, and that she was extremely inventive. She appears to have invented quite a number of alchemical apparatus, including something we now call the bain-marie, which I think you will find in many kitchens, which is thought to be named after Mary the Prophetess. And she was a Jewish woman who was operating in Alexandria and in Upper Egypt. And I think the proper setting for this early chemistry is textile and decorative arts, and making statues and jewelry and clothing and all of you could call it the high-end luxury market. People who had the money to spend on very beautifully crafted and high-level scientifically crafted products. And it's very interesting. In the 3rd century, the Emperor Diocletian, who had problems with rebels in Egypt, claimed that they were making gold through alchemy, and he issued an edict banning all alchemical books and that all the chemistry books should be burned. And as far as we know, something like this happened, and this would explain quite a lot why there was a terrible misunderstanding later of what the original art had been. But I don't think they were making gold in terms of producing sort of ingots of gold to finance rebellion. It was that the industry itself was extremely successful, I believe, and that they made a lot of money. And in that sense, any capitalist who takes an ordinary product but makes it profitable is turning lead into gold. And I think that irony is part of the confusion. This industry was highly profitable and earned a lot of monetary gold for its practitioners. You could become very rich making these things. So you can imagine there'd have been a lot of skullduggery and competition. And I'm sure a lot of the practitioners probably convinced themselves that they'd actually made gold. I'm sure of that.
Absolutely.
And therefore, they would have probably been in the business of deceit. And so, of course, this is gold. What do you tell? And if the gold dyes were really effective, most people couldn't tell the difference at all.
Our guest is Tobias Churton. His website is his name, linked up at coasttocoastam.com. Let's go to some calls here. First-time caller Jacob in North Carolina. Welcome to the show, Jacob.
Hey, thank you for having me. Hey, great show tonight. Love the topic.
Thank you.
Had just a quick question there for Dr. Tobias. You're talking about a person actually that I'm very familiar with, Krishnamurti, the Indian boy that was kidnapped during Madame Blavatsky's day, or after when all that stuff happened. Just two quick questions there, sir. Do you know if Aleister Crowley ever heard, since he died later on after World War II, you know if he ever heard Krishnamurti speak, to any audiences about his personal messages, about his thoughts, his beliefs about, culture, society, religion, and how that goes? And also, do you know if Aleister Crowley ever spoke to a Manly P. Hall? Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Okay, very good.
To answer your questions, Jacob, I don't think he did ever speak to Manly P. Hall. As far as I know, there's been a book written by Manly P. Hall recently I did a review of, and there was no mention of that. I've never heard of any connection. They may have known people in common. The answer to your other question, did Crowley know Krishnamurti personally? No, but he had friends in German Theosophical circles who went to hear Krishnamurti, and he was familiar with some of the things Krishnamurti was saying, most particularly in 1930, I think it was 1930, 31, early 30s anyway, when Krishnamurti renounced his claimed, as he never claimed it, it was claimed of him, this kind of messianic role, and he was aware of that for sure and regarded it as a victory. I personally spoke to Krishnamurti myself in 1983, which was quite funny because I was working for a television company, and he rang up trying to get an interview. I didn't know much about him except that the actor Terence Stamp was a devotee of Krishnamurti's very sound teachings. I don't think Crowley needed Krishnamurti, and I don't think Krishnamurti needed Crowley.
Do you know author Lionel Fanthorpe by any chance, Tobias? He lives out that way in the United Kingdom.
Sorry, George, what was that?
Lionel Fanthorpe. Do you know him by any chance? He's an author.
Yeah, he does the Fortune Times, doesn't he?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. I don't know him personally. I know he doesn't like Aleister Crowley very much because I think he reviewed my book some years back, and he insists that he's a reverend, of course, and a Christian minister, and I would be very surprised if any Christian minister would come out on the side of Aleister Crowley, who spent a lot of his time believing and asserting that Christianity, as he'd been taught, it had been superseded. Although I would say that Crowley was always very keen to say that his doctrine was already existed in the mind of St. Augustine, one of the great saints of the Church, who said, love and do what you will, which is a kind of condensation of a lot of Paul's teaching on the subject of love. And Crowley's two principles, do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law, and love is the law, love under will, strike me as being an essentially freedom-oriented interpretation of Christian teaching on love. But not a sloppy sort of sentimental love. It's love when it's directed to the will. When we talk about the will in Crowley, we're talking, as he would say, let me put it this way. He wrote in his diary in 1920, when I am doing my true will, or what you would call the will of God. Now, he believed that the will of God existed in potential in every person, that everybody has a particular role in life to discover. You have to discover it. You have to become conscious of it and practice it. And then you are doing the will of whatever made you, the highest. And the whole accent of his teaching is to reach the highest potential. He's not saying man as he is the highest God, but man as he is has this potential to touch the highest. And if I understand Christian doctrine, which is God became as we are, that we may be as he is, that's the incarnational doctrine in a nutshell, This seems to me to resonate with that. So to do your true will is, in conventional terms, to do the will of God. But this isn't an external will that somebody points the finger at the book and says, you must do this. You've got to find out what you are, what your real role is, and the love that you are able to radiate should be in tune with that will, and not just the kind of sloppy, sentimental kind of love that is all too easy to literally fall into.
In the international, let's go to Don in Alberta, Canada. Go ahead, Donald.
Hi, George. Hi, Tobias.
Hello.
I'm kind of confused about what alchemy is. Like, okay, so Aleister, he had asthma. Like, they've known for thousands of years, if you have asthma, you go live by the ocean or go hang out in a salt mine for a month or so, and your asthma will clear up. But I thought alchemy had to do with, like, reverse tempering metals. It makes it 100 times stronger by taking it down to minus 600 degrees. Or glass, if you make glass in a vacuum, it's 20 times stronger than steel. Or then there was Lawrence Gardner. He used to talk about the white powder gold or the Ormus gold that would increase your body's electricity and increase consciousness. It occurs naturally where a meteorite strike occurs. It can be manufactured, but it's not as good as the original stuff. So for somebody that wouldn't he know things like that? Or back then, knowledge was just limited. It's like Damascus steel. They said the art of making it has disappeared for like 5 or I can't remember, 600 years ago or whatever. But yet I was watching a video, and there's a guy in Korea, and he's making steel that looks just like Damascus steel. So I guess he's refigured out how to make it because it has the same patterns and the same sharpness. So how does spirituality get dragged into metal, I guess is my question. It's just
I think my book is the first alchemist, so it's a study of the earliest records of the practice.
Right.
And I keep to the late Roman Empire, which is when the original documentation that we have comes from. So it's focused on that. Alchemy or we're talking about metallurgical chemistry. Has many, many aspects, including those you've mentioned, for example, the making of swords and tempered steel and all of that sort of thing. And in that sense, metallurgical chemistry is with us now and in many forms, some of them traditional, some of them highly industrialized. So, yes, the origin of your industrial chemistry is these people we call alchemists. We perhaps miscall them. I think they should be called metallurgical chemists, because that's actually what they were doing. I can't remember what your question was about Aleister Crowley, but
there really wasn't one there.
No, I couldn't quite make that one out, but that's my answer anyway.
Let's go to Aaron in Seattle, Washington. Go ahead, Aaron.
Hey, guys, hope you guys are having a great night.
Yes, sir.
Hello.
Go ahead, Aaron.
Well, so I was wondering if I heard a lot about the early Egypt talk, and Khoser and Nofri. I mean, there was a lot of Egyptian pharaohs that were really fixated on colors, and especially gold. And there's been a lot of talk about, over the years, that the great pyramids of Giza were completely covered and glittering in the sunlight. And I'm wondering if that had something to do with alchemy. I mean, were they just literally making large batches of paint and putting them on the pyramids?
I think that's a really important issue, which I haven't raised before, which is that we know that this chemistry was being practiced by priests in ancient Egypt to various degrees of success. I mean, for example, they were able to make a kind of synthetic lapis lazuli, which was very used. And you're quite right that the colors were very important in Egyptian religion and associated with divinity. Gold obviously represented the sun. And My knowledge, your thing about pyramids shining, interesting idea that they may have been painted with a gold dye. I think, my God, they'd have had to make some. My understanding was that the original outer coating of, say, the Great Pyramid was a polished stone. And, of course, if you polish stone in those conditions, it's going to glitter like a diamond. I don't think you need any gold paint. However, the gold dyes were used in the making of votive statues. One of the things that Zosimus of Panopolis criticizes is that he says that the old priests of the old religion were duped by daimons, or demons, as most people pronounce it today, were duped by demons into worshipping these images and saying that the art of creating them required basically a pact with these demons. So Zosimus, by the 4th century, has realized that the priesthood of Egypt were keeping this knowledge to themselves and using it as a means to enslave the minds of the people around them. And what he's trying to do is to liberate this knowledge as a universal science. That's a very interesting development. But certainly in ancient Egypt, there was a chemistry being practiced by the priests. So that we know for sure. But they didn't have the industrial advantages that emerged after the fall of the Ptolemaic Egypt, when Rome invaded with the death of Mark Antony in 30 BC. And that coincides exactly with the earliest period of glass blowing. And I think glass blowing was the critical factor in taking the art to another level using distillation apparatus.
Well done with the book, The First Alchemist. Now back to Crowley for a second. What was the fascination with Crowley by rock musicians? Why were they into him so much?
I think that's there are two levels to that. One is the popular version of Crowley after John Simon's biography of him came out in 1951 was of an outsider rebel who did everything he fancied. So instead of do what thou wilt, it was interpreted as do as thou wilt. And the idea of a libertarian freedom fest was very attractive in the 60s to people who felt that conventional society had become a straitjacket and was imprisoning their minds. So the idea of a now dead sort of father figure, as it were, who advocated finding your own, if I may quote Isaac Hayes, the black performer of Shaft, do your thing. That's one of the 60s ethical commands. You must do your thing. Well, do your thing could be interpreted as I think John Lennon in his last interview with Newsweek in 1980 paraphrased Crowley directly when he said what he believed was do what thou willst, but don't hurt anybody. And that's do what thou wilt plus love is the law.
That's very important. Tobias, we're going to take a short break and come back and wrap things up with you in just a moment on Coast to Coast AM. And welcome back. George Norrie with Tobias Churton, and we're taking final calls as we talk about his work, The First Alchemist, and then the biography of Aleister Crowley. Josh in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. Hey, Josh, go ahead.
Hey, how we doing? Great show, great guest.
Thank you, sir.
I had a question regarding Aleister Crowley and his contribution to tarot and his book of Thoth, where, he claims that was one of his greatest accomplishments. I know he worked on it for a long time, and he took everything from astrology, astronomy, the Chinese Tao, and the Kabbalah Tree of Life, and, he really made a great magical system with what he contributed. So I just wanted to ask your guest if he could comment on that and about the OTO and the organization AA.
Go ahead, Tobias.
There's another program.
Yeah.
Right. On the tarot, I'd just like to say that it's so sad that he never saw his tarot work complete. While his book of Thoth was published in a small edition in 1943-44, the actual cards which he designed and which were executed by Frida Lady Harris, a most extraordinary artist, did a wonderful set of 78 cards, which were exhibited as paintings in London in 1944. He wasn't even allowed to the exhibition of these paintings, and he wasn't even mentioned by name in the prospectus for the paintings because of his reputation, which is very sad. In fact, the card pack wasn't published until the 1970s. You can buy it now, and that's thanks to the OTO, the Ordo Templi Orientis, the organization that Crowley basically reformed.
Would you have liked to have met him, Tobias?
Yeah, I think I would. I think we'd have had plenty to talk about for a long, long time. Yeah, I think it would have been most interesting, especially knowing what I know now.
He would have been a fascinating guy. Let me mention your website, tobiaschurton.com, which is linked up at coasttocoastam.com. A couple of his books include the one we're talking about tonight, The First Alchemist. He also wrote a book back in 2018 called The Spiritual Meaning of the 60s, which was quite fascinating as well. It's a incredible story, and he's done extensive work in all different ranges. Tobias, thank you for being on the program. And, of course, after talking about Aleister Crowley, you've got to talk about Edgar Allan Poe.
The Telltale Heart by Edgar Allan Poe. True, nervous, very, very dreadfully nervous, I had been and am. But why will you say that I am mad? The disease had sharpened my senses, not destroyed, not dulled them. Above all was the sense of hearing acute. I heard all things in the heaven and the earth. I heard many things in hell. How then am I mad? Hearken and observe how healthily, how calmly I can tell you the whole story. It is impossible to say how first the idea entered my brain, but once conceived, it haunted me day and night. Object there was none, passion there was none. I loved the old man. He had never wronged me. He had never given me insult. For his gold I had no desire. I think it was his eye. Yes, it was this. He had the eye of a vulture, a pale blue eye with a film over it. Whenever it fell upon me, my blood ran cold, and so by degrees, very gradually, I made up my mind to take the life of the old man and thus rid myself of the eye forever. Now this is the point. You fancy me mad? Madmen know nothing, but you should have seen me. You should have seen how wisely I proceeded, with what caution, with what foresight, with what dissimulation I went to work. I was never kinder to the old man than during the week before I killed him, and every night, about midnight, I turned the latch of his door and opened it, oh, so gently. And then, when I had made an opening sufficient for my head, I put in a dark lantern, all closed, that no light shone out, and then I thrust in my head. Oh, you would have laughed to see how cunningly I thrust it in. I moved it slowly, very, very slowly, so that I might not disturb the old man's sleep. It took me an hour to place my whole head within the opening, so far that I could see him as he lay upon his bed. Ah, would a madman have been so wise as this? And then, when my head was well in the room, I undid the lantern cautiously, oh, so cautiously, for the hinges creaked. I undid it just so much that a single thin ray fell upon the vulture eye. And this I did for 7 long nights, every night just at midnight, but I found the eye always closed, and so it was impossible to do the work. For it was not the old man who vexed me, but his evil eye. And every morning, when the day broke, I went boldly into the chamber, and spoke courageously to him, calling him by name in a hearty tone, and inquiring how he has passed the night. So you see he would have been a very profound old man, indeed, to suspect that every night, just at 12, I looked in upon him while he slept. Upon the 8th night, I was more than usually cautious in opening the door. A watch's minute hand moves more quickly than did mine. Never before that night had I felt the extent of my own powers, of my sagacity. I could scarcely contain my feelings of triumph. To think that there I was, opening the door little by little, and he not even to dream of my secret deeds or thoughts. I fairly chuckled at the idea, and perhaps he heard me, for he moved on the bed suddenly, as if startled. Now you may think that I drew back, but no. His room was as black as pitch with the thick darkness, for the shutters were close-fastened through fear of robbers, and so I knew that he could not see the opening of the door, and I kept pushing it on, steadily, steadily. I had my head in, and was about to open the lantern, when my thumb slipped upon the tin fastening, and the old man sprang up in bed, crying out, "Who's there?" I kept quite still and said nothing. For a whole hour I did not move a muscle, and in the meantime I did not hear him lie down. He was still sitting up in the bed listening, just as I have done, night after night, hearkening to the death watches in the wall. Presently I heard a slight groan, and I knew it was the groan of mortal terror. It was not a groan of pain or of grief. It was the low, stifled sound that arises from the bottom of the soul when overcharged with awe. I knew this sound well. Many a night, just at midnight, when all the world slept, it was welled up from my own bosom, deepening, with its dreadful echo, the terrors that distracted me. I say I knew it well. I knew what the old man felt, and pitied him, although I chuckled at heart. I knew that he had been lying awake ever since the first slight noise, when he had turned in the bed. His fears had been ever since growing upon him. He had been trying to fancy them causeless, but could not. He had been saying to himself, "It is nothing but the wind in the chimney. It is only a mouse crossing the floor, or it is merely a cricket which has made a single chirp." Yes, he had been trying to comfort himself with all these suppositions, but he had found all in vain. All in vain, because death, in approaching him, had stalked with his black shadow before him, and enveloped the victim. And it was the mournful influence of the unperceived shadow that caused him to feel, although he neither saw nor heard, to feel the presence of my head within the room. When I had waited a long time, very patiently, without hearing him lie down, I resolved to open a very, very little crevice in the lantern. So I opened it. You cannot imagine how stealthily, until at length a simple dim ray, like the thread of the spider, shot from out the crevice and fell upon the vulture eye. It was open, wide open, and I grew furious as I gazed upon it. I saw it with a perfect distinctness, all a dull blue, with a hideous veil over it that chilled the very marrow in my bones. But I could see nothing else of the old man's face or person, for I had directed the ray, as if by instinct, precisely upon the damned spot. And have I not told you that what you mistake for madness is but over-acuteness of the sense? Now I say there came to my ears a low, dull, quick sound, such as a watch makes when enveloped in cotton. I knew that sound well, too. It was the beating of the old man's heart. It increased my fury as the beating of a drum stimulates the soldier into courage. But even yet I refrained and kept still. I scarcely breathed. I held the lantern motionless. I tried how steadily I could maintain the ray upon the eve. Meantime, the hellish tattoo of the heart increased. It grew quicker and louder every instant. The old man's terror must have been extreme. It grew louder. I say louder every moment. Do you mark me well? I have told you that I am nervous. So I am. And now, at the dead hour of the night, amid the dreadful silence of that old house, so strange a noise as this excited me to uncontrollable terror. Yet for some minutes longer I refrained and stood still. But the beating grew louder. I thought the heart must burst. And now a new anxiety seized me. The sound would be heard by a neighbor. The old man's hour had come. With a loud yell, I threw open the lantern and leaped into the room. He shrieked once only. In an instant, I dragged him to the floor and pulled the heavy bed over him. I then smiled gaily to find the deed so far done. But for many minutes, the heart beat on with a muffled sound. This, however, did not vex me. It would not be heard through the wall. At length, it ceased. The old man was dead. I removed the bed and examined the corpse. Yes, he was stone dead. I placed my hand upon the heart and held it there for many minutes. There was no pulsation. He was stone dead. His Eve would trouble me no more. If you still think me mad, you will think so no longer when I describe the wise precautions I took for the concealment of the body. The night waned, and I worked hastily, but in silence. First of all, I dismembered the corpse. I cut off the head and the arms and the legs. I then took up 3 planks from the flooring of the chamber and deposited all between the scantlings. I then replaced the boards so cleverly, so cunningly, that no human eye, not even his, could have detected anything wrong. There was nothing to wash out, no stain of any kind, no blood spot whatever. I had been too wary for that. When I had made an end of these labors, it was 4 o'clock, still dark as midnight. As the bell sounded the hour, there came a knocking at the street door. I went down to open it with a light heart. For what had I now to fear? There entered 3 men, who introduced themselves with perfect suavity as officers of the police. A shriek had been heard by a neighbor during the night. Suspicion of foul play had been aroused. Information had been lodged at the police office, and they, the officers, had been deputed to search the premises. I smiled. For what had I to fear? I bade the gentleman welcome. The shriek, I said, was my own in a dream. The old man, I mentioned, was absent in the country. I took my visitors all over the house. I bade them search well. I led them at length to his chamber. I showed them his treasures, secure, undisturbed. In the enthusiasm of my confidence, I brought chairs into the room and desired them here to rest from their fatigues, while I myself, in the wild audacity of my perfect triumph, placed my own seat upon the very spot beneath which reposed the corpse of the victim. The officers were satisfied. My manner had convinced them. I was singularly at ease. They sat, and while I answered cheerily, they chatted of familiar things. But ere long, I felt myself getting pale and wished them gone. My head ached, and I fancied a ringing in my ears. But still they sat and still chatted. The ringing became more distinct. It continued and became more distinct. I talked more freely to get rid of the feeling, but it continued and gained definiteness until at length I found that the noise was not within my ears. No doubt I now grew very pale, but I talked more fluently and with a heightened voice, yet the sound increased, and what could I do? It was a low, dull, quick sound, much such as a sound a watch makes when enveloped in cotton. I gasped for breath, and yet the officers heard it not. I talked more quickly, more vehemently, but the noise steadily increased. I arose and argued about trifles in a high key with violent gesticulations, but the noise steadily increased. Why would they not be gone? I paced the floor to and fro with heavy strides, as if excited to fury by the observations of the men, but the noise steadily increased. Oh, God, what could I do? I foamed, I raved, I swore. I swung the chair upon which I had been sitting and grated it upon the boards. But the noise arose over all and continually increased. It grew louder, 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 and still the men chatted pleasantly and smiled. Was it possible they heard not? Almighty God! No, they heard, they suspected, they knew, they were making a mockery of my horror. This I thought, and this I think. But anything was better than this agony. Anything was more tolerable than this derision. I could bear those hypocritical smiles no longer. I felt that I must scream or die. And now, again, hark! Louder, 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 louder! Villains, I shrieked, dissemble no more. I admit the deed. Tear up the planks. Here, here! It is the beating of his hideous heart.
I love that reading. For Dan Galante, Tom Danheiser, Lisa Lyon, Lex Lonehood, Sean Ladesseur, Stephanie Smith, Chris Burrows, Tim Banal, George Knapp, and Ian Punnett, I'm George Norrie, somewhere out there on Coast to Coast AM. We'll see you on our next edition. Until then, be safe, everyone.